We're going to continue with a little bit more military stuff, especially talking about fortresses. But Machiavelli pauses and addresses his own time again and says, let's remember the situation. We've got all these foreigners, all these barbarians in Italy. Now, let's think about how we get rid of them. And therefore, he introduces this urgency, which, if you recall, is also the passion that he showed at the end of The Prince in driving the hordes of barbarians out of Italy. Well, what's the problem? Let's analyze this militarily for a minute. Here's the deal. The problems are the French are here. Again, they came in 1494. And the other problem is the Swiss. These Swiss soldiers are just very, very good, and there are a lot of them. Now, what do? Here's what I think we should do. He addresses this especially to the Pope, who, remember, is again a Medici, Pope Leo X. Wait for one of them to conquer the other. That is to say, you've got these different foreign troops in Italy. Sooner or later, they're going to come into conflict. They're not going to be just doing parallel things forever. They're going to bump into each other. Wait for one of them to conquer the other, and then join with the one that was defeated to beat the one who won. So wait to see what happens when one of them is significantly weakened, join the remainder of the weakened one, and then those two forces acting together, yours and theirs, should be able to defeat the more powerful one, and then with your new allies who are left, they're not going to be a big problem. Now, Machiavelli also says, I think that right now, again, we're talking about 1517, right now is a great opportunity. I think that's going to happen. If the Pope, remember again, the Pope in Florence, both Medici ruled, the Pope, if he just plays his cards right, if he just waits for the right minute, if he pays attention, if he is a little bit patient, and then if he takes action at the right moment, I think we may not be all that far from driving those guys out of Italy. So there's a kind of optimistic note here. Of course, we know it didn't quite happen. In fact, it didn't happen at all. But Machiavelli at that particular moment looks around and says, I've got some pretty good vibes, shall we say, about this. Well, Machiavelli asks this question. When you have won, when you conquer a place, how do you deal with those whom you have conquered? Here is the big answer. Do something, and do something bold, and don't be indecisive, and don't be wishy-washy. Take a course of action. For example, what did the Romans do? Well, sometimes they rewarded the conquered peoples with privileges and even citizenship. One of the stories of the history of Rome is the expansion of Roman citizenship. By the 3rd century A.D., basically every free person in the Roman Empire was a Roman citizen. Now, it took many, many centuries to get to that point. But the Romans would reward certain peoples whom they conquered and say, basically, come join us. You ally with them or you incorporate them into your territory by not treating them as subordinates but making them citizens. That makes sense. Sometimes when the Romans conquered a people, they destroyed those people or they sent colonies out to be planted there so that they were really firmly in control. They took over the land and all the rest of it. That's okay too. So there are different ways you may respond. And of course, the particular circumstances might decide which of those is better. The one thing you can say about Rome, though, it never was neutral. It was never wishy-washy. It was never indecisive. You have to decide what you're going to do once you get control of a territory, and then you've got to do it, and do it well, and do it thoroughly. And Machiavelli turns to a contemporary example. In 1502, and remember, this part of the discourse is written about 1517. In 1502, there was a revolt within the Florentine city-state by the city of Arezzo and the adjacent area called the Val di Chiana. What did Florence do? Florence was wimpy. Florence did a little bit of patting on the back and a little bit of punishing and sort of wishy-washy and back and forth, exactly the wrong thing to do after putting down the rebellion. And so this goes back to what Machiavelli says in The Prince. Princes need to take some risk. There's a certain boldness, and fortune favors boldness. And so he looks at the Romans and recognizes they didn't always do the same thing when they conquered a territory, but they always did something decisive. And that's what's important. Perhaps even more than what you do is that you act decisively. Now, as I indicated at the beginning comments in this lecture, Machiavelli talks about fortresses. Now, we all know, when we travel around Europe, travel around Italy or other parts of Europe, you see a lot of castles, a lot of fortresses. Some of them are urban. For example, the town right next to Florence, which is the town of Prato, has a huge fortress right in the middle. The city of Siena to the south has a huge fortress incorporated into its walls. And of course, you see a lot of fortresses out in the countryside as well. So given those marks on the landscape that we see, we know it's an important question. What's the role of fortresses? And here is Machiavelli's basic answer. The Romans did not build fortresses as long as the republic was virtuous. We talked about that idea of the virtuous republic earlier on in the discussion of the Discourses. When the people are living in an orderly way, this is the period, if you recall, where they pay their taxes when no one's looking. As long as the people are virtuous, you don't need and you don't want fortresses. Okay? Now, Machiavelli admitted that sometimes when the Romans captured cities, they kept the fortresses standing and took them over in those cities. But by and large, fortresses are not very useful. He says, not only that, if they were more or less useless to the Romans, they're even more useless now because of the fact that artillery makes them less strategically useful, makes them less impregnable than they were. So fortresses weren't a very good idea back in Roman times as long as the people were virtuous. That's a big if, of course. And they're even less useful now. In fact, he says, this is the way he puts it, fortresses are harmful in places that are occupied and useless at home. Good soldiers, not good fortresses, make the best defense. He also makes the point that if you have a fortress sort of in your hometown, if there's a fortress incorporated into the walls of your city, a place where you and your soldiers can go, it will make the government more violent toward the people because they have a place to run away to from the people. And since they know they've got a place to retreat to, after all, the people, if they get angry, they don't have cannons. So if you have a place that allows you to protect yourself from your own people, it's going to, at least in the long run, encourage you to be harmful to your own people. So fortresses, and if people choose to build them, are signs that something's wrong. Either you just simply make a mistake and you think they're useful when they aren't, or they are harmful and you don't see how they are harming your relationship with the very people you govern. Now, Machiavelli takes up one of these notions that doesn't common sense tell us that a good time to attack another country, another nation, is when it is divided, when there is real factional strife, when you've got parties going at each other? And that's an interesting question. But Machiavelli goes back to Livy. And he says there are stories of people attacking Rome, countries attacking Rome, when Rome was divided into factions. And guess what happened? The very fact that Rome was being attacked brought those factions together. It made Rome stronger. So if you attack a divided nation, you make that nation stronger. I think to some extent we saw that, perhaps only temporarily, we saw that after 9/11. The most partisan people around were saying, there are no Democrats, there are no Republicans, there are only Americans today. And we saw how, and this was certainly some of the rhetoric that we heard from our government, how the people who attacked us on 9/11 thought they would divide us or further divide us, and they've done just the opposite. Again, whether that's held is not an issue I want to discuss here, obviously. But that's the point that Machiavelli makes. You don't want to attack a nation because it's divided, because you will do exactly what you don't want to do, which is unite it. You're better off dealing with a divided enemy. And so, Machiavelli says, for example, here's the way Florence dealt with Pistoia. Now, we know how often Machiavelli is critical of Florence, but here's a place where essentially the Florentines played it right. Pistoia, a city, 15 miles, 20 miles or so, toward Pisa from Florence. Always a city known for its factions. Did Florence attack Pistoia? No. What Florence would do, Machiavelli says, was do little favors for one of the factions, whichever one was weaker at the moment. Because what you don't want to have happen is for one faction completely to conquer the other, because that will unite it. And so you keep sort of propping up and doing favors for and making promises to the weaker faction. And Machiavelli said that Florence did that for long enough that eventually Pistoia turned itself over to Florence. Florence didn't have to attack and capture Pistoia. Pistoia handed itself over. The factions were so bitter for so long that enough Pistoians said, we're better off under Florentine rule than the way we are. So here we are, Florence. Another example that Machiavelli gives, this time criticizing Florence, not praising Florence, is in Florence's relationship with Siena. Every time Florence looked at Siena and said it's divided, Siena was also known for its factional strife, although what city wasn't? Siena's divided, let's go finally knock off that annoying place to the south, which is always the way the Florentines viewed Siena. Sometimes it was more than annoyance, but it certainly was an annoyance. Let's go beat them now that they're divided. Every time Florence did that, Florence was unsuccessful because it brought all the Sienese together. Again, I can't resist illustrating how this has continued. I was talking to a woman in Siena one time. She and I belong to different neighborhoods in Siena, and neighborhoods that are in fact enemies of one another. So we were talking, we were reasonably cordial, and I said, I'm going to Florence tomorrow. And this old lady said, I've never been to Florence. Florence is 40 miles away. And I said, why not? And she said, well, I live in Siena. Why would I want to go to Florence? And we started talking about how much we disliked, some of this is just sort of stuff you make up to say, but how much we disliked Florence, not its monuments, but just simply sort of the feel of the place. And all of a sudden, when we started talking about Florence, we were in agreement on everything. It was really interesting. We left buddies because the subject was Florence rather than Siena. When we talked about Siena, we argued. We talked about Florence, we were big pals. We would agree on that. And so I think Machiavelli makes an important point here, one of those sort of counterintuitive points where you say, well, it's logical to go beat up on somebody when they're fighting within their own walls. Machiavelli says, don't be so sure of that. Machiavelli also says that when you conquer a people, and even when you are in struggles with people, you need to avenge injuries done. Here's an interesting story that Machiavelli tells. There was a Roman ambassador who went to the Gauls, and this Roman ambassador had acted very badly and unfairly toward the Gauls. This got the Gauls so angry that they attacked Rome, and in fact they took Rome. That was in the year 390 BC, the last time Rome had been taken for 800 years. What really sort of led to the actual attack on Rome, Machiavelli says, is the fact that the Gauls, who were already, in a sense, the enemy of the Romans, were so annoyed, not just by the ambassador, but the fact that the Romans wouldn't punish the ambassador for the way he acted, that they decided to attack Rome. He gives another example that comes from the Greek world. He tells about an issue of homosexual rape. A guy named Pausanias was raped by Attalus, and he complained to his king, Philip of Macedon. Okay, very famous king, 4th century BC. Well, instead of Philip punishing Attalus, he made Attalus a governor. Pausanias was so angry that he murdered King Philip. You can't let those kinds of things go unpunished. You can't have, if you will, those open sores when there are obvious injustices that are done, even if they're done by your own people. Even if it's done by an ambassador of your people to sort of an enemy people, you've got to take care of that. You've got to punish it. You've got to do justice. Machiavelli argues that you never try to buy allies. You just don't do that. You also should not disarm your own people. These are common tactics that were being used in Machiavelli's day. How are we going to get this little country over here, this little city-state over here, to do our will? How are we going to get them to sign on to our ideas, to become an ally? We'll buy them. Doesn't work. Another common tactic, you say, gee whiz, if the people are armed around me, they could rise up against me. Don't let that fear dictate policy, Machiavelli says. The Romans never acquired territory with money. They never made peace with money. They did not disarm their own citizens. Florence seems to do all these things wrong. First of all, he said, Florence, when it did conquer the Romagna, remember, after all, or parts of the Romagna, after all, Cesare Borgia's activity sort of ended in failure, what did they do? They got there and bought off everybody. Never a good idea. The foundation of Rome was not money. The foundation of Rome, the basis for its success, was the Roman people. An armed people. You don't disarm people you trust. And therefore, it's very important, Machiavelli says, to recognize what really matters. Again, money has its role. Money is important, but it doesn't win wars, and it doesn't win even the diplomatic wars. Money isn't the name of the game. Other things are the name of the game. In war, it's good soldiers. In other situations, you punish, you reward, but you don't buy off. That just doesn't work. The foundation of Rome was not its wealth. The foundation of Rome was its citizens. And having said this, Machiavelli returns to one of those moments where he says, let's stop and think some more about the value and role of history generally. Let me read you a passage from the second discourse. Because fortune is changeable, republics and states often change, and they will continue to change until someone rises up who is so devoted to antiquity that he will regulate fortune in such a way that she will have no cause to demonstrate, with every revolution of the sun, how powerful she can be. Why do things seem so chaotic now? Why do so many things we do not work? Here's the answer. We don't take history seriously. And when we don't, we have no stance to take with regard to fortune. We have no stance to take other than a kind of reactive stance when something happens. Again, it can be a natural activity, like a flood. It can be the election of some unexpected candidate as pope. It can be the death of some particularly important military figure. It can be dust blowing in your face the moment you attack another army. Things like that happen. The reason our world is so chaotic is because nobody's prepared to stand and deal with fortune as fortune needs to be dealt with. That we have to realize that the way you minimize and mitigate fortune is by preparedness. You can't prepare for every detail. But again, you know every now and then a river's going to flood. Even Cesare Borgia. After all, it might be that his dad died at an inconvenient time. But hey, dads die. And he wasn't quite as ready for it as he should have been. And therefore, things got out of his hands when he failed to act as he might have, and when he had not yet gotten all the cardinals in his pocket to dictate who the next pope would be. So what we need to do is read history, because history gives us so many stories of different kinds of things that can happen, and how some nations have or have not been prepared for them. Hey, the Roman Republic lasted almost 500 years. A lot of bad and unpredictable things happen in 500 years. Again, there are storms that sink your fleet, and there are attacks you have no way of anticipating, and there are all the other things that happen. But you need to sort of bear arms against fortune. You can't conquer fortune, but you can regulate fortune, and therefore you can have some sort of order even in a world in which there are some random things that occur. But how would you know how to be prepared? How would you know what some of the range of preparations would be if you haven't looked to see how people have been prepared and not? What kinds of things have tended to work in what kinds of situations, and what kinds of things have tended not to work? You look around and say, well, here are several historical examples of people buying off nations they just conquered to make peace, and gee, none of those ever worked. We at least have to ask very, very carefully whether we're in a situation now that's so different that we can go ahead and do that same failed policy and honestly expect a different result. It happens. But you aren't prepared even to ask the right questions, Machiavelli says, if you really haven't seriously studied history. Another point that Machiavelli makes, I think, is very interesting, and certainly it's one we Americans have thought about at the beginning of the 21st century. Machiavelli says it is risky, very risky, to trust exiles. People who have been kicked out of their countries and who want to go back. Why? First of all, they believe things that are false. And secondly, they're willing to use guile. They're willing to mislead people they talk to because they are trying to manipulate people to take the kind of action that would lead them to be able to return home from exile. Their goal is not your interest. Their goal is their interest. And very often it's easy to take exiles at face value, almost always a mistake. Furthermore, Machiavelli says, if it turns out they get their wish, if, with your help even, they are able to return to their nation, they will often abandon you because they've never been really that caring about you in the first place. They've wanted their own agenda back home where they lived. And once they get back home and you're no longer useful to them, they'll dump you. To be very, very careful with exiles. They'll tell you what you want to hear because they want you to do things that will allow them to get back. Be very, very careful about this, Machiavelli says. Here's something else Machiavelli recommends. In Rome, the government, and that government means not just an individual, but the various offices, right? Offices of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. We know how that works. The government basically gave military commanders a great deal of power in the field to make decisions based on the situation. Florentines don't do that. The Florentine government, which is after all made up of middle-class merchants by and large, the Florentine government wants to micromanage war. And that's not a very good idea. You've got to have confidence in your commanders, and you've got to give them some authority. And remember what Machiavelli said earlier in Discourse 1. And if they make a mistake out of malice, you punish them. And if they make a mistake out of ignorance, you actually reward them because you want people to continue to have that flexibility and creativity and not say, well, I think I should do this. I think this is a great opportunity, but it's sort of risky, and if it fails, I'm just going to get clobbered. You don't want to put commanders in that situation. Now, I want to turn to the third of the three discourses. That's where we are now, and I'm going to finish this lecture with some stuff at the beginning of the third discourse and then talk about the third discourse in the next lecture as well. He talks about how republics can last a long time. After all, Rome did. What is the secret of success? And by the way, Machiavelli expands his discussion. How do states last a long time? How do religions last a long time? And the answer that Machiavelli gives is quite interesting. Republics, and later on we'll talk about religions, republics need to renew themselves often through their own institutions. Every republic that's had any success at all has some good to it. And obviously, like everything, republics change, and they must continue to go back to basics, back to what were the original good qualities that allowed them to succeed in the first place. Rome underwent a disaster in 390 BC. As I pointed out in this lecture and other lectures, the Gauls took the city of Rome. So what did the Romans do? Well, they got rid of the Gauls, for one thing. We'll start with that. But when they did, they didn't say, well, hooray for us. We're Gaul-free now. Let's go back to the old way we've been doing things just before the Gauls arrived. No. They renewed their institutions and almost, Machiavelli says, almost started afresh. They sort of said, okay, now that we've gotten rid of this problem, let's figure out how we got in the situation where we were able to be conquered, and let's go back to basic principles. Let's go back and see if we don't need to clean up our institutional act. Let's see if we don't need to fix our institutions, rewrite some of our laws in light of how we started out, what our basic values were that were incorporated into our older constitution, our older customs and values. So that republics need renewals. They go through, in some sense, life cycles. If you don't change, in some real sense, you die. You've got to change, but change doesn't mean going off in some totally new direction. Change means going back, in a sense, to what brung you there. Going back to the basic standard values. Now, as Machiavelli points out, there were institutions in Rome that allowed that to happen. For example, the institution of the censor. Another one of these offices elected every now and then. One of the things it did was sort of clean up the list of who the senators were, because how you got to be a senator was sort of an informal process. And the censors, and of course we have some negative connotations of that word censor, but censor really had to do with the word census, making a list of who's in what tribe, who's in the Senate, how we enroll new peoples who have become citizen, and what places we put them in our institutional framework. Those were offices that sort of focused on the republic, continuously going back to its basic foundations. And in fact, Machiavelli says such a reevaluation, such a renewal needs to take place about every 10 years. And he says during the rule of the Medici, that's Cosimo, Piero, and Lorenzo, from 1434 to 1494, it was said at that time that the state needed to be taken back every 5 years. You know, this has a certain Jeffersonian ring to us about it, but Machiavelli says that republics grow old, and they grow brittle, or they go off in wild new directions that really are not true to their most deeply held values, or they try to create something totally new that's not the correct response. They need to go back. Again, you can't do that if you don't know history, and you can't do that if you don't know how to use history creatively. And Machiavelli ends this section talking about the renewal of religions. And he says the reason Christianity even exists today in a form that we know it, this is a pretty wild statement, is because of two 13th century reformers, Francis of Assisi and St. Dominic de Guzman. These two great reformers lived in poverty in imitation of Christ. They preached, they heard confessions. They argued to the people that if priests live sinfully, it was the people's role to be obedient to them. This was not about revolution, but God would judge them. Now, it's hard to imagine Machiavelli and Francis of Assisi being buddies, even across the ages. You know, Francis is Mr. Humility, Mr. Simplicity, Mr. Poverty, Mr. Peacemaker. But what Machiavelli does recognize is that whatever you think of the values of Christianity, Francis and Dominic renewed, made new again, reformed, formed again the church. And that model of church reform allowed the church to continue. It's not a bad analogy to have when we think about a similar need for the reform of political institutions.